They sat around the glowing Thanksgiving table, my mother raising her glass, not to me but to my brother, handing him a check for over $1 million, as if I wasn't even there. Then in front of everyone, she turned to me with a smile, as cold as the wind outside, and said, "I belonged at the train station, more than with them, and that is how I, Lauren Carter, found myself abandoned on Thanksgiving night, carrying nothing but the sting of her words." The air outside carried that unmistakable November chill as I stepped out of the cab in front of my parents' house in Providence. Warm light spilled through the windows, and I could already hear laughter and clinking glasses drifting out into the night. My stomach tightened the way it always did when I came home. No matter how much I prepared myself, walking back into that house meant stepping back into an old wound that never quite healed. Inside, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon hit me instantly. The dining room was already buzzing. My mother Diane swept past me in a shimmer of pearls, fussing over the perfectly folded napkins. She barely acknowledged me, just a quick glance before rushing to Matthew's side. My younger brother stood tall and confident in his new tailored suit, shaking hands with uncles and cousins, like he was the guest of honor. Maybe he was. He had always been the one she built her world around. I slid off my coat and found myself invisible in the corner, offering small hellos that went mostly unanswered. My father Richard gave me a nod from across the table, but didn't bother to come over. He poured himself another glass of red wine and laughed at something Matthew said. My mother placed her hand proudly on Matthew's shoulder, glowing like she had won a prize. I felt that familiar sting, the reminder that no matter what I achieved on my own, it was never enough in this house. Dinner began, silverware clinking against fine china, conversation flowing easily around me, but never to me. My aunt asked Matthew about his new business idea, and he launched into a polished explanation of his tech startup. The table leaned toward him, hanging on his every word. I tried to follow along, but my mind wandered, caught between resentment and longing. I wanted to be part of it, yet I knew my voice would never be welcomed here. Then came the toast. My mother rose to her feet, glass in hand, smiling at everyone around the table. I braced myself, already knowing where this was headed. She spoke about family, about gratitude, about legacy. And then, with a dramatic flourish, she announced that she and my father had decided to make an investment. Her words sliced the air, sharp and deliberate. They were giving Matthew $1.3 million to fully fund his company. The room erupted in cheers and applause, chairs scraping the floor as relatives reached across the table to congratulate him. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of my plate so hard my knuckles turned white. No one looked at me. Not until my mother's eyes finally found mine. There was no warmth, no pride, just that sharp edge she had always reserved for me. "You have always been a disappointment," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire table. "You chose the wrong path, and look where it got you. Teaching art classes for scraps, while your brother builds a real future." A few chuckles rippled through the room, and my chest burned with humiliation. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but the words stuck. I could feel every gaze pinning me to my chair, measuring me against Matthew, confirming what they had always believed: that I was less, that I didn't belong. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping the polished floor. My voice finally found me, trembling but clear. "I came here to spend the holiday with my family, not to be shamed in front of them." The room went quiet, except for the crackle of the fireplace and the clinking of someone setting down a fork. My mother's smile curled cruelly at the edges. She raised her glass again, as if sealing the moment in front of everyone. "You belong here more than with us," she said, her tone cold and final. The words landed heavy, louder than the clatter of cutlery or the whispers that followed. It wasn't just a dismissal, it was banishment. For a second I stood there, unable to breathe. Matthew glanced at me, his expression unreadable, caught between pride and discomfort. No one else moved. My father poured another drink. My mother turned back to Matthew, radiant once more, as though I had already disappeared. I picked up my coat with shaky hands and walked out into the cold night. The door closed behind me, shutting off the warmth and laughter, leaving me standing on the front porch with nothing but the sound of the wind and the echo of her words still ringing in my ears. The night air cut into my skin as I stepped off the porch and down the front steps, my heels crunching against the frosted pavement. I walked quickly without knowing where I was going, my breath turning white in the glow of the streetlights. My hands shook as I pulled my coat tighter, and for a moment, I thought about turning back, about knocking on that door again and demanding they see me. But I knew better. That door was closed for good. A cab slowed when I lifted my arm, and I slid inside the warmth of the heater hitting my face. The driver asked where to, and the first place that came to mind was the station. I muttered, "Providence Union Station," and he nodded without another word. As the car rolled through the quiet streets, I stared out at the passing shops, decorated with holiday lights, families gathered inside laughing, clinking glasses. It felt like the entire city was celebrating while I was being exiled. The station loomed ahead, its grand stone arch lit by cold neon, a hollow shell of welcome. I paid the driver, my fingers clumsy with the bills, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The wind tore at my hair as I climbed the steps, the heavy doors giving way to a blast of fluorescent light and the echo of voices. Inside, the cavernous hall stretched above me, tiled floors, reflecting the movement of travelers rushing to and from their trains. I stood there for a moment, motionless, letting the chaos swirl around me while I tried to steady my breathing. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, half hoping someone had changed their mind, that maybe my father had decided to reach out. Instead, it was Heather. A flood of messages lit the screen, each one sharper than the last. "You embarrassed them again. You never belonged in that family. You are the stain we all had to live with." I swallowed hard, the words burning as if they were etched into my skin. My thumb hovered over the screen, wanting to throw the phone across the hall, but I couldn't let go. I read every single message, each one confirming what I had heard at the dinner table. I sank down onto a wooden bench near the departure board trains, flashing in and out of schedule above me. Around me, families bustled with luggage, children tugged at coats, lovers kissed goodbye. The sound of a loudspeaker announced arrivals and departures, a voice indifferent to the weight in my chest. I pulled my coat tighter and tried to make myself small, invisible among the crowd. For the first time in my life, I realized I had nowhere to go. Another message came through. Heather had sent a picture of the family still seated at the dining table, glasses raised, smiles wide. I wasn't in it, of course. I never had been. My hands trembled as I stared at their joy, my absence unnoticed, my chair filled with light instead of me. I pressed the phone to my chest and felt the sob rise in my throat. I fought it, but the tears slipped free, hot and relentless against the chill of the station. A woman dragging her suitcase slowed when she passed me, her eyes flicking toward mine with brief sympathy before she moved on. No one stopped. No one ever stopped. I wiped my face quickly, trying to compose myself, but my body shook with the effort. I felt like a child again, the same child who once sat alone in her room while her brother was showered with attention. Only now, it wasn't a bedroom door that shut me out. It was my entire family. The minutes stretched, and I kept waiting for the sound of my phone to change, for a different name to appear on the screen, for someone to tell me to come home. But it never came. More texts from Heather kept filling the void, her cruelty endless. I set the phone down on the bench beside me, unable to look at it anymore, my heart heavy and raw. The station blurred through my tears, the lights bleeding into streaks of white and gold. My chest ached as I realized the truth pressing down on me. They had left me here on purpose. They had meant every word. I buried my face in my hands and let the sobs come. The sound of my crying was drowned by the shuffle of footsteps and the announcements echoing above, but to me it was deafening. I had been stripped of everything, humiliated in front of my family, cast out into the night, and now abandoned in a station full of strangers. For the first time, I could not pretend it was anything other than what it was. My family had truly rejected me. I sat there frozen on the bench, my hand still pressed against my face, when I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder. I flinched and looked up, expecting a stranger, maybe someone asking if I was all right. Instead, I saw a familiar pair of kind eyes, framed by a wool scarf pulled tight around her neck. My grandmother Rose stood there, her breath visible in the cold draft that swept through the station doors. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair completely silver now, but her presence filled the space like a warmth I had forgotten could exist. "Lauren," she said softly, her voice steady. "What are you doing here all alone?" For a second I couldn't answer. My throat burned from holding back too much. All I managed was a broken whisper. "They left me." Her expression didn't change, but her eyes held mine long enough for me to see she understood more than the words I managed to get out. Without hesitation, she reached down, lifted my bag that was still at my feet, and nodded toward the exit. "Come on, child. You don't belong sitting here in this cold. You're coming with me." I rose slowly, still dazed, and followed her out of the main hall. The sound of the station dulled behind us as we walked through the glass doors into the night. A black sedan idled at the curb, its driver stepping out quickly to open the back door. She had arranged this, I realized, as if she knew something like this might happen. I slid into the leather seat beside her, the warmth of the heater wrapping around me like a blanket I didn't know I needed. For the first time that night, I exhaled without my chest tightening. The drive north was quiet at first. Streetlights streaked across the windows as Providence faded into the distance, the highway opening ahead. My grandmother sat upright, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. I waited for her to ask questions, for her to demand details, but she didn't. She simply sat beside me as if her presence was enough to carry me away from the humiliation still burning in my skin. Finally, she spoke. "You are stronger than you know. That family may have pushed you out, but you are not finished. Not by a long shot." Her words hung in the air, both a comfort and a puzzle. I wanted to ask what she meant, but the lump in my throat kept me silent. We arrived in Boston past midnight. The city lights sparkled across the harbor as we wound through familiar streets I hadn't walked in years. The car stopped in front of an old brick building tucked between newer towers, its facade weathered but dignified. Rose guided me inside, her hand, steadying me as we climbed the narrow staircase. At the third floor, she unlocked a door and handed me the key. "This is yours now. An old place, but it's warm and it will keep you safe." I blinked at her, confused. "Grandma, I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" She smiled gently, pressing the key into my palm. "Because you need a place to rest, and soon you will see why." That was all she said. The apartment smelled faintly of cedar and old books. A single lamp lit the living room, casting soft light on the worn couch and the shelves lined with photographs. I saw pictures of my mother as a child, of my father, before his hair turned gray, of me holding Matthew when he was a baby. My chest ached as I studied the faces, remembering a time when we still looked like a family. Rose set my bag down and pulled a blanket from the arm of the couch, draping it over my shoulders. "Sit. You need tea." She disappeared into the kitchen, the clink of porcelain echoing softly. I sat staring at the key still in my hand. It felt heavier than any metal should, as if it carried meaning I couldn't yet name. My phone buzzed again, and dread shot through me. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. More messages from Heather filled the screen, mocking me, calling me the disgrace of Thanksgiving, attaching laughing emojis as if my pain were a joke. My grip tightened until my knuckles whitened. I wanted to throw the phone across the room to shatter it against the wall, but instead I shoved it deep into my bag. Rose returned with 2 steaming mugs and set one in front of me. She didn't ask what was wrong. She simply looked at me and said, "Let it go for now. Tonight you rest." I sipped the tea, its warmth spreading through me, but my mind refused to quiet. Every word from that dinner table, every smirk, every cheer for Matthew replayed in my head. I felt as though I had been erased, rewritten as the villain of my own family story. Tears welled again, but I blinked them away, determined not to collapse in front of the only person who had shown up for me. Rose must have sensed it. She placed her hand over mine and gave a reassuring squeeze. "There are things you don't know yet. In time you will. Until then, trust me." Those words were simple, but they landed like a promise, a thread of hope I hadn't expected to find in the ruins of this night. I stayed on the couch after she went to bed, staring out the window at the city skyline. My reflection looked back at me in the glass, tired, red-eyed, but still standing. I clutched the key in my fist until sleep finally pulled me under. The ache of being rejected was still raw, but for the first time since I walked out of my parents' house, I wasn't alone. Morning light spilled into the apartment through thin curtains painting the walls in soft gold. I woke with the blanket still draped around me and the key clenched tight in my fist. For a moment I didn't move, letting the quiet settle the muffled sounds of the city seeping in from outside. I had slept, but my dreams had been restless, filled with echoes of voices that never seemed to leave me. My mother's sharp words, my father's silence, the sound of Matthew's laughter. They always came back to me. I rose slowly, stretching the stiffness from my body, and wandered toward the small kitchen. Rose had already left a note on the counter in her neat handwriting. She had gone to run errands and told me to eat whatever I found in the fridge. I made coffee, the bitterness filling the air, and sat at the small table by the window. My phone sat there too, face down, a weight I couldn't quite ignore. I reached for it reluctantly, bracing myself for more of Heather's cruelty, but the screen lit up with something else. A news notification. My eyes caught the headline and my stomach dropped. Rhode Island's rising star, Matthew Carter, to lead new tech venture. His smiling face stared back at me, polished and confident, standing between my parents at some gala I hadn't known about. My mother's hand rested proudly on his arm, my father's grin wide with approval. The article gushed about his vision, his determination, the promising future he was building. I skimmed the lines, each one cutting deeper, until I reached the photo again. Matthew, in a tailored tuxedo, radiating the pride I had never been allowed to claim. I set the phone down. My chest heavy, the bitter coffee doing nothing to clear the taste of it. My mind wandered back uninvited to childhood moments that had shaped everything. I remembered the time I brought home a painting from art class, colors splashed across the canvas with all the joy I could put into it. I had been 10, my cheeks flushed with pride. My father barely looked at it before shaking his head. "Art won't pay bills, Lauren. Your brother's science project now, that's something." He had pointed at Matthew's gleaming poster board with diagrams and equations showering him with praise. I had stood there holding my painting until my arms ached, realizing no one wanted to see it. Another memory followed, sharper than I wanted it to be. My mother sitting in the front row at Matthew's school debate, clapping the loudest, her eyes shining, as if he were the only person in the world. I had been backstage at the same event, waiting to perform a solo on the piano, scanning the crowd for her face. She never came to hear me play. The applause when I finished had felt hollow because the only people I wanted to see weren't there. That was the first time I told myself to stop expecting them to show up. I pressed my palms to my temples and tried to push the memories back. I told myself it was the past, that I had survived it, that I didn't need their approval anymore. But the truth was clear in the reflection staring at me from the window. I was still measuring myself against them, still trapped in the shadow they had cast over me since childhood. Matthew had always been the star, and I had been whatever was left. The coffee had gone cold, but I drank the last sip anyway and stood. My eyes fell back to the phone on the table, the headline still visible on the dim screen. I picked it up again and stared at Matthew's face. He looked so sure, so untouchable. I felt the ache of comparison clawing at me, but then something shifted. I realized I couldn't keep living this way, defined only by what they thought of me. If I stayed still, I would remain the ghost at their table, the girl erased from family photos, the sister no one defended. My breath came heavy, but I whispered to myself, barely audible in the quiet room, "If I don't change this, I will always be their shadow." I gripped the edge of the counter, steadying myself as the weight of that truth sank in. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Outside, the city carried on horns, blaring footsteps echoing on sidewalks. I stood in the middle of the small apartment, the key still on the table, the article still glowing on my phone, and felt something stirring I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of resolve. The chill of the morning air clung to me as I stepped outside the streets of Boston, humming with life. I pulled my coat tighter and walked quickly, almost driven by an impulse I could not resist. There was one person I had always trusted, One person I thought might remind me that I still mattered. Emma Collins had been my closest friend since college, the kind of friend who once promised we would face everything side by side. If anyone could ground me now, it would be her. Her apartment was only a few stops away on the subway, a small walk from the station. My nerves tightened as I rang the buzzer waiting for her voice. When she finally answered, her tone sounded cautious, almost clipped. I told her it was me, and after a pause the door buzzed open. I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last, until I reached her door. She stood there when I arrived, her arms crossed over her sweater, her smile faint and forced. "Lauren," she said, as if testing the name on her tongue. I smiled weakly, trying to mask the storm inside me. "I just needed to see a friend," I said. I hoped those words would be enough. Emma stepped back, letting me in, but the warmth I remembered between us wasn't there. Her apartment was neat, with the faint scent of coffee and lavender, but the silence felt strained. She gestured toward the couch, and I sat down carefully while she poured water into 2 glasses. "So you're back in town," she said, placing the glass in front of me, but sitting at the other end of the couch. I nodded. "For a while now," I admitted. "Things have been rough." She looked at me, her eyes softening just a little before hardening again. "I've heard things, Lauren. People talk, you know." The words hit me harder than I expected. I tried to laugh it off. "People always talk. What exactly did you hear?" But she shook her head, her lips pressed tightly. "It's not my place to repeat everything. I need to be careful about who I let close." My chest tightened, confusion colliding with anger. "Emma, it's me. You know me. Since when do you listen to rumors instead of your own eyes?" She lowered her gaze to her hands. "It's not that simple. There are things out there, and honestly, some of it made me wonder if I ever really knew everything about you." I felt my throat dry as I tried to defend myself, but the words tangled. After everything we had shared, she was hesitating now, doubting me, because of whispers I couldn't control. I wanted to reach across the couch, shake her, remind her of all the nights we stayed up talking, the secrets we never told anyone else. Instead, I sat frozen, my palms pressed into my knees. Emma glanced at me, her expression conflicted. "I'm not saying I don't care about you, Lauren. I always will. But right now I need space. Things are complicated." I forced a small nod, though my heart cracked at the sound of her words. Space was just another word for distance, another way of telling me I was no longer welcome. We sat in silence, the clock ticking in the kitchen filling the room. I tried to sip the water, but it tasted flat, useless against the lump in my throat. After a few minutes, Emma stood and walked to the door. "I think it's best if we end here for today. I'll reach out when I can." I rose slowly, my body heavy, and walked toward her. At the door, I turned to her one last time. "Whatever you've heard, remember who I am. Remember everything we've been through." Her eyes softened for a heartbeat, but then she looked away. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice low. The hallway felt colder than the winter air outside as I stepped out and heard the lock click behind me. I stood there staring at the closed door, willing it to open again, but it didn't. I walked down the stairs, my footsteps echoing each one, driving the truth deeper into me. Out on the street, the city moved briskly around me, people rushing past with bags, with plans, with lives that had room for them. I felt hollow, carrying the weight of another door closed, another person stepping back. Emma had been my last anchor outside of Rose, the one friend who had always been my safe place. Now even she was uncertain, poisoned by the whispers I couldn't see or fight. I shoved my hands into my pockets and walked aimlessly, the wind cutting across my face. Each block I passed reminded me of all the years I had spent believing that if I just worked harder, loved deeper, tried more, I could hold on to the people I cared about. But tonight, I knew something different. Trying had never been enough. By the time I reached the subway entrance, the ache inside me had hardened into something heavier, a dull weight pressing on my ribs. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, watching strangers hurry into the tunnels below. I felt like one of them nameless unseen, except they all had somewhere to go. I pulled in a shaky breath, forcing myself to move. The train roared as I descended the platform, vibrating under my feet. I leaned against a cold metal column, my reflection staring back from the glass of the arriving cars. My face looked tired, older than it should. I thought of Emma's eyes, the distance in them, and I knew I had lost something I might never get back. When the doors opened, I stepped inside, found a seat near the back, and let the city swallow me whole. I pressed my forehead against the window as the lights blurred past the ache inside, sharper than ever. Whatever resolve I had felt that morning was still there, but it was buried now beneath the truth I could no longer deny. Even the people I thought I could trust were slipping away. The call came from Rose early the next morning, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that made my stomach twist. She asked me to meet her downtown at an office on Boylston Street. She said it was important, and I heard something in her tone that left no room for hesitation. I dressed quickly, pulling on the cleanest clothes I had, and made my way through the brisk air. The city was alive with traffic and chatter, but my mind was blank except for the sound of her steady voice repeating in my memory. The building was tall and polished, the kind of place where men in dark suits passed each other with purpose. I pushed through the glass doors, my reflection catching in the shine, and told the receptionist I was here to see Gregory Harris. She nodded and directed me to the 11th floor. The elevator felt like it was carrying me somewhere I wasn't ready to go. When the doors opened, Rose was waiting in the hallway, her coat draped over her arm. She smiled softly when she saw me, the kind of smile that tried to ease nerves before they unraveled. "Lauren, thank you for coming," she said, squeezing my hand gently. "Come on, let's go in." The office was lined with shelves of thick law books, certificates framed on the walls, and a long mahogany table that stretched across the room. A man in his late 40s stood to greet me. His suit immaculate, his hair streaked with gray that only seemed to add to his authority. "Gregory Harris." He introduced himself, his handshake firm. "Please have a seat." I sat between Rose and him, my heart pounding. Gregory slid a folder across the table, the papers inside neatly stacked. "Before we begin," he said, "I want you to know that what we're about to discuss has been carefully planned with every precaution taken. Your grandmother has entrusted me with her wishes." I looked at Rose, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She gave me a small nod. "Go on, Gregory." He opened the folder and pulled out a thick document. "This," he said, "is a trust. Your grandmother has established it in your name. It contains assets totaling $15 million, structured to protect you fully, and to ensure that no one can easily challenge it." The words felt unreal, echoing in my ears. $15 million. I blinked, my breath catching. I looked at Rose, but she sat steady, her gaze fixed on me. Why, I managed to whisper. Because she said gently, "You have been cast aside when you should not have been. I watched you walk away that night, and I knew I had to make sure you had something that would not be taken from you. This is my way of protecting you, of giving you the future your parents never allowed you to believe in." My throat burned and I shook my head. "It's too much. I don't even know what to do with something like this." Gregory leaned forward, his tone measured. "That is why I am here. The trust is structured carefully with oversight and protections. You will not be alone in managing it. However, I must warn you, families rarely accept being left out. Your parents and your brother will almost certainly contest this." The room tilted slightly, my pulse racing. Contest it. Of course they would. I could already hear my mother's voice dripping with contempt, already calling me unworthy, already rallying against me. I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself. Gregory continued. "There is more. To safeguard this, your grandmother has recorded a video statement. It outlines her reasoning, her intent, and her clear wish for you to be the beneficiary. It will hold up in court should this be challenged." He slid a flash drive across the table. "This is a copy. The original is stored securely." I picked it up with trembling fingers, the weight of it heavier than anything I had ever held. A video of Rose speaking directly, her words immortalized to defend me. I tried to swallow, but my voice came out broken. "Why would you do all this for me?" Rose reached across the table, taking my hand. Because you are mine, as much as Matthew is theirs, and I will not let them erase you. Tears blurred my vision, but they didn't fall. I felt suspended between disbelief and gratitude, the ground shifting under me. I thought of the cold of Union Station, the sting of Emma's distance, the hollow of years of rejection. Now suddenly there was this. A lifeline, but one wrapped in chains of expectation and looming battles. Gregory leaned back, watching me carefully. You must prepare yourself, Lauren. They will come after you with everything they have. They will try to paint you as unstable, irresponsible, undeserving. You cannot allow their narrative to define you anymore. I drew in a shaky breath and nodded through the fear pressed tight against my ribs. Rose gave my hand one more squeeze, her eyes fierce in their quiet determination. You are stronger than you think, she said. They may try to fight this, but they will not win if you stand your ground. The papers on the table blurred as I stared at them, the words unreadable through the fog in my mind. $15 million. A trust. A battle I hadn't chosen but could not escape. My heart beat with both awe and dread as the reality set in. When we finally left the office, the cold Boston air hit my face like a jolt. Rose walked beside me, her step steady. I clutched the flash drive in my pocket, as though it were the only thing tethering me to the ground. The city stretched out around us, the noise of traffic and voices crashing together, but all I could hear was Gregory's warning repeating in my head, "They will come after you." It started with a single message on my phone, a link sent by someone whose number I didn't recognize. At first I ignored it, but curiosity gnawed until I tapped the screen. The headline lit up in bold across a glossy news site. Carter family rift over multi-million-dollar trust. My stomach dropped as I scrolled. The article was vague, citing unnamed sources, but it described an inheritance that had blindsided the Carters, hinting at betrayal, at scandal, at a daughter turned against her family. My name was there in black and white, surrounded by speculation. I froze in the middle of Rose's living room, the words swimming in front of me. The story spread fast, picked up by other outlets within hours. By evening, it was everywhere. Photographs of my family at galas, Matthew on stage, receiving awards, my parents smiling with dignitaries. And then me, a single unflattering shot from years ago, walking out of a coffee shop with messy hair and tired eyes. They had dug me up from obscurity only to make me the villain. Rose turned off the TV when she saw my face pale. Do not read too much of it, she said firmly. They thrive on twisting words. But I could not look away. Another article had already surfaced, this one nastier. It described how I had been left at Union Station on Thanksgiving, abandoned in the cold. The tone dripped with pity, but the comments beneath cut deep. Strangers dissected me like they knew me. Some called me pathetic, others defended me, furious at my parents. The world suddenly had an opinion on my pain, and it made me feel exposed, raw-hunted. My phone would not stop buzzing. Messages, calls, emails. Emma sent nothing, only silence, but Heather's number flashed across my screen with cruel persistence. I finally answered, once my voice sharp. What do you want? Her laugh crackled through the speaker. Just watching you squirm, Lauren. The whole world knows now. You think this makes you look like a victim? But give it time. People will see what you really are. She hung up before I could respond. My hand shook so badly, I almost dropped the phone. The next morning, every major network ran the story. Reporters stood outside my parents' house in Providence, shoving microphones toward Diane and Richard as they walked to their cars. My mother's tight smile barely masked her fury as she snapped, "No comment." My father's jaw clenched, his face red as he pushed past the cameras. It only made things worse. Clips replayed on television, analysts discussing the optics, questioning the family's reputation. On social media, hashtags trended. Union Station daughter. Thanksgiving abandonment. Some posts were supportive, strangers calling me brave, demanding answers from my parents. Others mocked me, questioning my motives, suggesting I had orchestrated the scandal myself. I scrolled endlessly until Rose gently pried the phone from my hands. Enough, she said. You are letting them consume you. But the storm only grew louder. A local Boston paper published an op-ed, condemning Diane and Richard, accusing them of cruelty, of valuing wealth and image over their own child. The writer called the train station incident a symbol of heartless elitism. Television anchors debated whether the Carter name could recover. Their polished image, once untouchable, was unraveling in front of millions. I lay awake that night in Rose's apartment, the glow of my phone illuminating the dark, as notification after notification poured in. My chest ached with every new headline, every twisted version of my story. Yet underneath the fear, a flicker of something unexpected stirred. Power. For the first time, the truth of what they had done was out in the open. They could no longer hide behind their perfect smiles. Still, the weight of it crushed me. I had never wanted my private humiliation to become a public spectacle. Now every move I made would be dissected. Gregory called to warn me, his voice steady but urgent. "This exposure changes things, Lauren. The legal battle will not be fought in court alone. It will be fought in the court of public opinion. They will try to bury you with spin and influence. You must be ready." I pressed the phone to my ear, my throat tight. "I never asked for any of this." "I know," he said quietly, "but you cannot run from it either." The following day, news vans lined my parents' street. Neighbors whispered, some avoiding eye contact, others relishing the drama. Matthew issued a carefully worded statement to a reporter outside a cafe, his tone dripping with rehearsed concern. "My sister has been struggling for years," he said, "and we only want what is best for her." It twisted the knife, framing me as unstable a burden, the black sheep. Rose watched the clip on television and shook her head. "They are digging their own grave." People can see the falseness in his smile. But I wasn't sure. The world loved a polished villain almost as much as it loved a messy one. By the weekend, the scandal had escalated. National networks were running segments, not just local papers. Talk shows joked about Union Station comedians making light of abandonment on Thanksgiving. Hashtags kept trending. My parents canceled public appearances, their charity events postponed amid outrage. For once, they could not control the narrative. I stood by the window of Rose's apartment, looking out at the Boston streets below the hum of the city, carrying on while my world tilted. My family was floundering under the weight of public scrutiny, and though the pain of it all still pressed heavy against my ribs, I couldn't deny the strange satisfaction curling inside me. They had wanted me erased, forgotten, invisible. Instead, the world was forcing them to face what they had done. The scandal was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar. And there was no going back. I walked back into the old brick building of the Boston School of Fine Arts with my head high and my stomach twisted in knots. The corridors smelled of turpentine and clay, familiar scents that had once meant home to me. Students bustled past carrying canvases, professors' voices echoed from open studio doors. For a moment, I almost felt like the girl I had been before everything, before the scandal, before Union Station. Then the whispers started. Faces turned eyes, followed some sympathetic others, sharp with curiosity. They had all read the headlines. I told myself it didn't matter. I still had my project. The exhibition proposal I had worked on for months had made it past the first round of the council's review. If I could see it through, if I could create something undeniable, maybe it would prove that I was more than the messy caricature the media painted me as. In the council chamber, a long room with tall windows and polished wood, the members sat in a half circle. Their eyes rested on me, some kindly, some skeptical. At the edge of the room, leaning casually against a chair with an air of entitlement, was David Ross. He had been a classmate once, then a rival, and now a constant thorn. His smirk made my skin crawl. The chair of the council invited me to present. I laid out my sketches, photographs, and models, speaking with all the conviction I could gather. My vision was about resilience, about how abandonment could be transformed into art that spoke to universal pain. My hands trembled, but my voice held steady. For a heartbeat, I believed I had them. Then David stepped forward. His voice dripped with false concern. He commended my passion, then turned the knife. He said the council should be cautious about attaching their reputation to someone whose name was tangled in scandal. He spoke of how my project was tainted by the perception that I was only here because of family money, not merit. He even suggested that the trust fund I had inherited was the only reason I could afford the scale of my work. The words hung in the air like poison. Murmurs rippled through the room. My heart pounded as I stared at him, his eyes gleaming with triumph. One of the council members cleared his throat and asked if there was merit to David's concerns. Another whispered to the chair. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but the decision came swift and cold. The council announced that for the sake of protecting the institution's reputation, they would temporarily reassign leadership of the exhibition to David until my personal matters were resolved. The air seemed to vanish from the room. My chest felt hollow as I heard David's polite thank you, his voice carefully masked with humility. My work, my vision had just been taken from me in front of everyone. I gathered my papers with shaking hands, forcing myself not to cry. Colleagues averted their eyes, some pitying, some relieved. It wasn't them. My legs felt heavy as I pushed open the chamber door and stepped out into the hall. But then something inside me snapped. I turned back, re-entered the room, and spoke with a steadiness I did not know I still possessed. I told them I would not accept being silenced, that my art was not charity, and it was not a scandal. It was truth. I said I would build my own platform, my own gallery if I had to, using the trust not as a crutch, but as a foundation. I told them that one day when my work stood on its own, they would regret choosing convenience over courage. The room was silent. David's smile faltered for just a second. The council chair shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I left before they could dismiss me again. My pulse thundered, my cheeks burned, but for the first time in weeks I felt something sharper than despair. I felt resolve. Outside, the winter air bit my skin. Snowflakes drifted in the wind, melting as they landed on my coat. My hands clenched around the folder of sketches pressed to my chest. I walked down the steps, each stride surer than the last. They had tried to strip me of my voice, but instead they had given me a reason to fight louder. The city moved around me, cars, rushing people hurrying with shopping bags, the scent of roasted chestnuts drifting from a vendor's cart. Life went on, indifferent to my humiliation. But inside me, the determination had solidified into something unshakable. I was no longer just the daughter abandoned at Union Station. I was no longer the girl dismissed in whispers. I was someone who had something to prove, and I would. The snow kept falling as I walked away, the chill sharp but invigorating my mind, already turning over plans I had never dared consider before. Emma called me one evening, just as I was sketching ideas on the dining table of the small apartment. Her voice shook in a way I hadn't heard since we were teenagers, whispering secrets in the dark. She asked if she could come over, that it was urgent. I hesitated, remembering her distance, the way she had turned her back when I needed her, but something in her tone made me say yes. When she arrived, snow dusted her hair and her cheeks were red from the cold. She didn't sit right away. She paced the small room, wringing her hands, before finally pulling her phone from her coat pocket. She said she had found something, and it was bad, very bad, but this time it wasn't about me. She handed me the phone. On the screen was a folder of files, screenshots, emails, and edited video clips. At first I didn't understand. Then I saw my name plastered across documents accusing me of siphoning funds from a student grant program, claims that I had used charity money for my own benefit. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. Emma said she had stumbled across the raw files while helping a colleague at her firm clean out old records. The timestamps didn't match, and when she dug deeper she realized they were fabricated. She traced the edits back to a PR firm on retainer for my family's business. And at the center of it all was Heather. I sat down hard in the chair, the phone trembling in my hands. For weeks the whispers had grown articles implying I was a fraud, that my art was nothing but a money pit. Now the proof lay in front of me, that it had been orchestrated, calculated, and carried out by the woman my brother called his partner, and my parents treated like a daughter. Emma's eyes filled with tears. She said she had believed some of the rumors at first, which was why she had pulled away. She apologized, voice breaking, admitting she hadn't wanted to believe the worst, but she also hadn't defended me. She said she was sorry, that she should have trusted me. For a long time I didn't speak. The weight of betrayal pressed so heavily that my throat burned. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone against the wall, but instead I set it down gently on the table. I told her the truth hurt, but the lies had cut deeper. Still, her coming here mattered. Her choosing to bring me this mattered. Emma nodded and said she couldn't undo the damage, but she could expose the truth. Before I could answer, she composed an email right in front of me. She attached the unedited files, the proof of manipulation, and sent them to 3 journalists known for tearing through corporate corruption. Her hands shook, but her face was set with determination. Within days, the headlines shifted. Articles appeared not about me, but about the smear campaign. Reporters dissected the altered documents, naming the PR firm and hinting at Heather's role. Talk shows debated the story of a young woman abandoned at Union Station whose own family had tried to destroy her. The public outrage reignited, but this time the fire burned in my favor. I watched the news with Emma sitting beside me, her presence both strange and comforting after weeks of silence. Reporters played clips of Heather at charity galas, then cut to experts explaining how the financial data had been doctored. Comment sections exploded with condemnation. Hashtags called for accountability. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt the suffocating weight on my chest begin to ease. People believed me. My name was no longer a punchline, but a rallying cry. Matthew called once, his voice tight and conflicted. He asked if it was true if Heather had done it. I told him to look for himself. He hung up quickly, and I didn't know which way he would turn. But even the doubt in his tone was more than I had hoped for. Emma reached across the table, her hand covering mine. She whispered that she was with me now, no matter what. The sincerity in her eyes reminded me of the friend I used to trust with everything. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Relief mingled with a sharp ache. Clearing my name had come at a cost. My family had not only abandoned me, they had tried to destroy me. And though the world was finally beginning to see the truth, the scars they left would not vanish overnight. Yet as dawn crept in through the blinds, painting the apartment with pale light, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself in weeks. It was small, fragile, but unmistakable. It was hope blooming again in the cracks of all that had been broken. The days that followed felt like moving through a storm, every headline screaming my name, every conversation turning toward the family that had abandoned me. Gregory reminded me daily that the trial was approaching and warned me to be ready for the worst. He said my brother had been pressured to testify against me, and hearing it spoken aloud left a pit in my stomach I couldn't shake. One evening, while the city streets glowed with slush and headlights, I received a message from Matthew. He asked to meet. The words were short-clipped, almost reluctant, but there was something different in them, a hesitation that made me curious. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a small coffee shop tucked behind an old church in downtown Providence. The place was nearly empty, only a couple of students tapping on laptops and a man reading a newspaper. Matthew looked thinner than I remembered, his eyes hollow, his suit wrinkled in a way that suggested he hadn't been sleeping. For a long time he just stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking against the cup, and I waited. Then his shoulders slumped, and he confessed he had been cornered. Mom and Heather had made it clear he was expected to stand against me in court, to paint me as unstable and unworthy of Grandma Rose's trust. His voice cracked as he said he didn't want to, but the weight of their expectations was crushing him. I stayed silent, letting him speak. He explained how every conversation at the house had turned into accusations about me, how Heather whispered in his ear about protecting the family legacy, about the dangers of letting me control money I would surely waste. But then his voice dropped lower, trembling, as he recounted what had finally broken him. He had followed Heather one afternoon to a private dinner hosted for select reporters. He hadn't been invited, but curiosity got the better of him. From across the room, hidden near the service entrance, he overheard her laughing with a journalist. She bragged about planting stories about twisting facts until I looked like a thief. Then, as if that wasn't enough, she sneered about Grandma Rose calling her a senile old woman who had been manipulated into leaving me the trust. Matthew's hands shook as he told me. He said hearing those words, seeing the smug smile on Heather's face, had made his stomach turn. He had always believed Heather was sharp and ambitious, but never cruel. That night shattered what little faith he still had in her. I could see the turmoil in his eyes, the boy I grew up with flickering beneath the man shaped by our parents' favoritism. For the first time in years, I saw him stripped of arrogance, just my younger brother frightened and ashamed. He admitted he couldn't keep pretending. He said he would not testify against me no matter what Mom and Heather threatened. He would not stand in a courtroom and destroy his own sister to protect their lies. Hearing him say it out loud left me stunned. I searched his face for any sign of deceit, but there was only exhaustion and a desperate need for forgiveness. Something inside me shifted. For so long I had seen him only as the golden child, the one who had everything I was denied. Now I saw the chains that came with it, the way he had been used as their weapon. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his confession pressing down on both of us. Finally, I told him that if he truly meant it, then it mattered. Not just for me, but for him, for the chance to step out from under their shadow. Matthew nodded, tears brimming, but never falling. He looked younger in that moment, like the boy who once asked me to teach him how to draw crooked little houses with crayons. He whispered that he was sorry for the words he had repeated, for the times he had stood by while I was humiliated. I didn't forgive him, not fully, not yet. But I told him I heard him, and that was enough for now. When he left, the night air was sharp and cold, but my chest felt lighter. For the first time, I wasn't the only one carrying the truth. My brother had seen it too, and he had chosen, however falteringly, to stand beside me. As I walked back toward the apartment, snowflakes settling on my coat, I realized the battle ahead was still brutal, still uncertain. But the lines were shifting, and not everyone in my family would be standing on the other side of the courtroom. The courthouse in Suffolk stood like a fortress of stone, its high columns shadowing the cold steps, where reporters clustered, cameras flashing as soon as they spotted me. Gregory walked beside me, his briefcase in hand, his expression steady. Matthew trailed just behind, head down, his presence silent but louder than any words. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and old wood polish, and every footstep echoed like a drumbeat. We entered the courtroom and I saw them waiting. My mother sat ramrod straight, her dark coat pristine, her face cold and unreadable. My father leaned close to her, whispering something I couldn't hear. Heather was there too, polished like she was attending a gala rather than a trial. Her lips curved in a faint smile when our eyes met. She had always been confident in her schemes, certain she could manipulate the narrative. Their lawyer, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit, rose to address the judge. He painted me as unstable, a woman who had spiraled into self-pity and recklessness, a liability unfit to inherit such a fortune. He gestured toward my parents, insisting they had only ever wanted to protect the family legacy from being squandered by someone unwell. Each word was a dagger dressed in civility but meant to cut. I sat frozen at first, my palms damp, my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. Then Gregory rose. His voice was calm, firm, the kind that carried without needing to shout. He laid out the evidence step by step, dismantling each accusation with documents, timelines, and testimony. He reminded the court that opinions and gossip were not facts, and that legal precedent was clear. Then he played the video. The screen flickered to life, and there was Grandma Rose sitting in her favorite chair, with the quilt folded neatly behind her. Her voice was steady, her gaze direct even through the camera. She spoke of her intentions clearly, that she had chosen me as the rightful heir, not out of impulse, but out of recognition of my strength, my perseverance, and her unwavering belief in me. She dismissed the notion of senility with sharp wit, reminding anyone who doubted her that she had handled her affairs meticulously until her final days. The room grew still. Even the reporters leaned forward. My mother's face flushed, and for the first time, I saw something flicker behind her eyes, a crack in the polished armor. Heather's smile vanished, her nails digging into her palm as she whispered urgently to their lawyer. Gregory let the silence stretch before finishing. He said no amount of slander could erase a woman's clear intent or rewrite the truth she had recorded for this very moment. The judge listened, hands folded, eyes scanning the documents one last time. My chest felt tight, the air heavy, every second dragging like an hour. Finally, the judge spoke. The will and trust were valid. The accusations of instability were unfounded. The inheritance, as designed by Rose Carter, would remain intact. The gavel struck, and the sound reverberated through me like thunder. I had won. I closed my eyes not in triumph, but in something deeper, a release of years of weight pressing down on me. Around me the world erupted. Reporters scrambled pens, scratching cameras, clicking. My mother gasped a sharp intake of air that was almost a sob, though she covered it quickly with anger. My father muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if refusing to believe it. Heather stormed out her heels, striking the floor like gunshots. Matthew touched my shoulder lightly, a gesture so small, yet so monumental. He didn't need to say anything. His choice had already been made, and in that courtroom, his silence spoke louder than testimony. Gregory leaned close and told me it was over, at least in the legal sense, though he warned the fight outside would continue with whispers, articles, and bitterness that no ruling could erase. I nodded because I knew he was right. As we left the courtroom, the winter sun broke briefly through the clouds, casting pale light across the marble floors. Reporters shouted questions, thrust microphones toward my face, but their words blurred together meaningless noise against the pounding of my own thoughts. It was done. The law had spoken. For the first time, the truth was not buried under their lies. And though the scars remained, I carried something stronger with me as I stepped into the cold air outside. The breath that left my lungs in that moment felt different, lighter, as if the cold air itself was cleansing me. In the weeks that followed the ruling, the fallout unfolded exactly as Gregory had predicted. My parents returned to Providence to find whispers turned into open scorn. Their jewelry store, once the pride of our family, saw its regular clients vanish. Neighbors who had attended our Thanksgiving dinners avoided eye contact at the grocery store, and society pages that once praised my mother's elegance now dissected her cruelty. Heather fared no better. The PR firm that had once showcased her as their rising star quietly terminated her contract, citing damage to their reputation. Brands that had trusted her to manage their image pulled back, unwilling to be tied to a scandal that had become a case study in betrayal. I read the headlines with a strange sense of detachment, not triumph. Karma was not loud. It was efficient, stripping away everything they had used against me. Matthew reached out first. His voice cracked over the phone, full of regret. I had never heard from him before. He confessed to the weight he had carried, the pressure of always being the golden child, and the shame of finally seeing what it had cost. He asked to meet not as rivals, but as siblings, and when we did, his eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders hunched. He apologized sincerely, and though forgiveness was not immediate, I saw a boy who had once been my brother, and not just the puppet of our parents. In Boston, I found myself standing in front of an old building near the Charles River, the kind of place that had history etched into every brick. With Gregory's guidance and the funds from the trust, I purchased it and began the transformation. It would become the Carter Art Foundation, not just a gallery, but a sanctuary for young artists who had been overlooked or dismissed, the kind of people I once was. The work was exhausting, exhilarating, and every stroke of paint on the new walls felt like rewriting my family's legacy in my own hand. Emma returned to my life quietly. She showed up one morning with coffee and a folder full of grant applications she had started drafting on her own. Her apology was simple, unadorned, and when I asked her why she had come back, she said she had seen what truth looked like when Heather's lies fell apart, and she wanted to stand on the side that built something instead of tearing it down. Together, we became partners, not just in friendship, but in vision. The opening night of the foundation came faster than I expected. The gallery glowed with soft lights, canvases lining the walls, sculptures resting on pedestals. Young artists stood nervously beside their work, waiting for validation they had rarely received. As I walked through the space, I saw pieces of myself reflected back in their art, the longing, the rebellion, the quiet hope. When the first guests arrived, applause broke out, and I realized this was no longer just about me. It was about creating a family of voices that had been silenced too long. Matthew attended that night, standing off to the side, at first unsure of his place. But when he approached carrying a donation check, he insisted be anonymous. I saw that maybe slowly bridges could be rebuilt. My parents were not there. They never would be, and I had stopped waiting for them. Later, when the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, I stepped outside onto the foundation's front steps. The city stretched before me, alive with sound and movement. For a fleeting moment I remembered the platform at Union Station, the cold bench beneath me, the hollow echo of my mother's voice telling me I belonged there more than with them. The sting of that night would never vanish completely, but it no longer defined me. Now I stood not abandoned, but surrounded by people who believed in me, people I had chosen and who had chosen me back. Family was no longer a word chained to blood or obligation. It was something rebuilt, redefined, alive in every corner of the foundation we had created. The scars were still part of me, but they had become lines in a larger story, one that no longer ended at a train station in the dark. It continued here in the light, with a future that finally felt like mine.